So yeah, sorry, I'm going to use the adrenaline of a mad rush across London to launch into my talk. I'm gutted to have missed James's talk, actually, because I was going to be very interested to hear how they might or might not fit together. I suspect they would have a lot in common in terms of some of the themes that we want to pick on. But when I spoke to Keith about doing a talk here, I was conscious that I was moving from the public sector at Office for National Statistics to Financial Times. And when it comes to visual narratives, there's a difference between working in a government department which releases statistics largely on a cyclical basis, and an organisation that's aligned to the news agenda very, very tightly. So I thought the point that James made about time being a very important component in deciding what you do with visualization is absolutely right. What I thought I'd do, though, is pick on a few specific themes in terms of things that have worked both in my time at ONS and also at the FT, things that are used at the FT, sorts of principles that you can use for visualization that apply very well across a kind of a range of applications. And the first example I wanted to pick on is to actually design with data. And what does that really mean? And I've got a couple of examples to show you. The first example is this one. I did some work with UNESCO last year, who had asked me to look at some of their reports that they'd been producing and how they could improve visualization in a report. You know, it's a fairly common requirement now. People want to beef up the way that they present their data. And one of the things I'm conscious of is that people feel that they need to reinvent the wheel. Let's liven up our report full of wonderful new visualizations to engage with readers. That's fine, but I think you should be designing with data. And so the example I've got here is that this report is an end-of-decade report from UNESCO and UNICEF on access to primary education. And it's full of charts like this. And I'm just going to leave that up for 10 seconds to allow you to read that. And this is a big, glossy publication. A very important topic, and now you've read the chart, you know what's going on, right? Okay. The problem here with a lot of visualizations in reports like this is that the visualization isn't standalone, and it can't teach you anything on its own, independent of the words that it's written around. And that's largely a problem. For a number of reasons these days, one of which, for example, is very progressive, is that if you make your images stand alone, they work very well on social media, for example. But also, how many of you have dared not to read every word in a long report and ended up skipping through the images? You know, you want the images to carry the narrative, and this isn't really carrying the narrative. But it is picking up on a really important topic. Gender parity index of the adjusted net intake rate in primary education. I mean, who isn't interested in that? The thing with this data is it ranges in value from about 0.85 to 1.10, something like that. And you kind of think, okay, I lob that data into my software and it will come up with a bar chart, and I'll put the bar chart into the publication. I'll order the bars in order of their values, but there's so many bars, I'll ask the reader to go for a chiropractic adjustment after they've read the chart. So this is exactly the sort of thing where I said, well, look, without going too far away from the starting point, let's just see if we design with the data what we can do to this chart. First thing, mercifully, is we'll just rotate it. Okay, so now we can read it, because as a cartographer, I've always worried that whenever you need to fit things into small spaces, there's usually an inverse relationship between the small space and the length of the word that you need to get into that small space. Next, it's not obvious from the chart, but in the report you realize that actually this data is about equality of access to education. And the value 1 in this data set represents equality. So I'm just going to dip it into some special solution which takes the bars back out and spins them round on 1. So the visualization is now showing us variation from equality. And just that one act, if I go back to the original, look at Pakistan on the original. You probably didn't spot it very quickly because it's the smallest bar tucked away in the bottom left-hand corner. On the transformed version, Pakistan is that first bar. And we annotate the chart to show what does that line of 1 mean. To the left, it's where more boys are enrolling in education than girls. On the right, it's the reverse. And we denote 1 as our line of equality. There's also a shaded area on the original chart, but the shaded area wasn't explained. If you read the report, the shaded area is actually UNESCO's achievement of gender parity. So any country getting a score in that grey area is actually achieving the policy target. So let's annotate that because that's pretty important. Then we'll rename the chart and say this is not about the gender parity index of the adjusted net enrolment rate. This is gender equality in primary education that we're looking at. And what I'll do is I'll pick out the people, the countries who are not in that parity zone. And let's explain what picking that out means. It means that actually the orange bars are where girls are disadvantaged in access to education. Blue is where the boys are disadvantaged. And suddenly, without changing it from being a bar chart, the images are very, very different. We're designing with the data by recognizing that the underlying pattern and the underlying relationship in this data is deviation from a set value rather than the overall magnitude of the values. And then we introduce some hierarchy onto the display to draw people's eyes to what's important. Because filling the colors, everything with corporate red, does nothing for the reader. Red is a highlight color. It's not the sort of thing, you know, who's got a living room wall that's painted broad red? You know, it would be quite difficult to look at it all the time, and it's the same sort of reasoning here. The second thing I wanted to talk about, so, you know, design with data, recognize the relationships in the data that are most important and draw them out. The second thing I want to talk about is context. Recognizing what context do you need in your visualization to paint a broad enough picture of what your data is saying. And I've got an example here recently from the FT. Chris Campbell at the FT, very talented graphic artist at the FT, was asked to produce a map of where UKIP had finished second in the constituency votes at the recent general election. And here is a cartogram view of where UKIP came second. And it's an interesting enough map. It becomes much more interesting when you actually compare with where UKIP won and where they finished third. And so you're thinking, oh, actually, there are some very interesting patterns coming out here where we start to play across the relationships of first, second, and third. What makes it even more interesting? What kind of context would be really interesting here, do you think? Is there anything else we can offer here to make this even more interesting? Well, let's have a look at all the other parties. First, second, and third. And interestingly now, you can realize that if you contrast the Liberal Democrat performance with UKIP, particularly in the third place results, you get this real sense of how the voting distributions have been changed by the UKIP, the arrival of UKIP on the political landscape. And what's lovely about this is when you've then taken the time and the space to draw this information together, something magical happens. You can drive the narrative with it. You can place it at the center of what you're reporting. It doesn't suddenly become the graphic that is livening up the text. You know, the text fits around it because the graphic is carrying so much information. Context doesn't need to be as extensive as the example I've just given. Context can be just as simple as annotating your graphs properly. This is from William Playfair's 1801 Statistical Atlas. He invented the line charts, so he has something to say about them. And even he realized, you know, in Georgian Britain, he realized, actually, if I take that annotation away, that chart becomes much more difficult to read. bothering to take the care to explain the relationship between the lines, in this case means it's no longer graphing two variables. It's no longer looking at imports and exports. It's imports and exports and the balance without having to draw the third line on. The annotation actually allows you to do that, and it tells you where to look. That means that we shouldn't ignore the value of well-annotated bar and line charts. I've deliberately kind of focused a lot of the talk on those sort of primitives, because what we can do in that space is, instead of worrying about our visualization being interesting enough, your worry is the data interesting enough? And if it is, then people will tune into it. The problem that we have these days with traditional forms like this, though, is the limits, the constraints. So, for example, if I'm looking at the GDP per capita of some Latin American countries, 4 lines is probably how much you can get away with on a line chart like this. What if I want to go with all of them? I've realized that the context for looking at the GDP per capita is to look at GDP per capita for all of the Latin American countries, and instantly I've got spaghetti. So what can we do? Well, a simple thing is to go back to this point of hierarchy. Not all of the data in your visualization needs to carry the same weight. If there are some components in there just providing context, and there are some components in there that you want to focus on and highlight, then bring them out. So let's sit all of these Latin American countries' time series into the background, and then just bring forward the one that we're interested in highlighting. The value of this is, let's say I was interested in highlighting Trinidad and Tobago's fairly remarkable GDP time series. If I had just graphed that time series and nothing else, I'm missing out on an interesting piece of context, which is it's remarkable in the context of all of the other countries in that area. And so, again, think about the context that you can provide through adding other data sources. Of course, this has got a limit, because your interest might be sort of stirred by what some of these other lines are. What is the country that's actually was originally much higher and has failed to accelerate away? This graph's not going to solve that problem. There are always trade-offs that you have to make. So you could take it into all sorts of other directions. Let's take the data and push it into small multiples, which is a nice way of looking at all of the series on a page in one go. The trade-off here is that you're having to do a lot more scanning as the reader. Okay, so again, it's the design trade-off. Another option might be to think, well, actually, I could condense the whole time series if I wanted to focus on the rise of Trinidad and Tobago, for example, but allow myself to see all the other series, is to push it into something called a slope graph, slope chart. And here, by just condensing it into 2 time series points, I can actually label and annotate all of the other countries. And as a result of that, I can rank all of the data for 2 different years as well, so you can see the variation is in ranking. And I used that recently on a data blog post at the FT, so talk about the news agenda, who's a Volkswagen driver. We found some interesting data from a user motoring website where people submitted their own fuel consumption values for their cars. And here's an interesting use of a slope chart in that the grey lines here are the Volkswagen Golfs from 10 years ago, and the red lines are the current Volkswagen Golf range. The column on the left is the official miles per gallon. The column on the right is the user-reported miles per gallon. And again, the graphic, without any further annotation, I mean, nobody moaned that they couldn't find their 1.6 diesel estate on the chart. It's broader than that. But the graphic carries so much of the story that the narrative, the text, changes. The text plays a kind of a sat-back role. And when you're talking about time series, of course, you don't necessarily need to talk just about line charts as the only way of presenting that. And this is just to show you that there are other ways of presenting time series in static images that can be pretty powerful. So this data set's looking, this is people dead or missing in the Mediterranean this calendar year. And it's obviously pretty grim data that there's been deaths throughout the year. But this sort of heat map calendar is quite effective at showing you, if you look at August, reinforcing this point that deaths became a daily event in August. And although there have been deaths throughout the year, the pattern of events had changed. This sort of visualization is quite good for seeing repeated temporal patterns in a data set, where you're less interested maybe in the absolute peaks and troughs in the data, but a general sense of the temporal patterns. So if they're weekday, weekend, seasonal, monthly, you can carry multiple patterns in this sort of visualization. There's a reason why I've flagged up as well migrant deaths as a data set here, because sometimes you're dealing with a data set where there are real sensitivities involved in what you're showing. And condensing that data down into just a series of simple geometric shapes and colors can make everything seem a bit cold. Okay? So how about empathy? How do you show empathy in a visualization? It's really difficult. If you read the books of Edward Tufte, he often speaks about this visualization as being one of the best visualizations ever. The story of Napoleon's march to and retreat from Moscow. And it is a very, very effective visualization at showing the numbers of soldiers who made it to Moscow, which is the tan line, and the number of soldiers who made it back, which is the black line of retreat. It's a stark visualization of the numbers. But one thing had always bugged me about this visualization. I always worried, I thought, if it's so good, how come any book that I pick up about the Moscow campaign itself never features this map? It's more likely to feature in visualization books than it is in history books. Why is that? And I think it's because there's a lack of empathy in here. That all it's showing you is the numbers, and not an awful lot about the qualitative and sort of experience of that campaign. And so, I mean, and as an example of that, have a look at this. On the retreat, when the army got to the river Berezina, something terrible had happened, which is that the bottom of this map shows the temperature during the retreat, and there'd been a very gentle thaw. All the way through the retreat, it had been bitterly cold, but there'd been a thaw just before they got to the river Berezina. They were freezing, and just before they got to the river, they burned all of their bridge-making equipment because they thought the rivers would be frozen, and they needed the wood for heat. So that wasn't a great start. And the fact that the Russian army were then lying in wait for them as well meant that if you can see the width of that line is reduced by about 50% at the river Berezina. It's quite a major incident. Are there any other views of that? Yes, there are. They are the data journalism views of the 19th century about what was actually going on at the Berezina at that time. And the moment you start to focus on an event in terms of the human experience of that event, you get a slightly different view of that data. The fact that you can start to see sort of soldiers freezing to death in drowning in the river is something that Minard's graphic can't convey. So that's why when you see a lot of modern graphics, there's kind of an implicit assumption that you can't do it all just by showing the volume or the quantity of the numbers, that you have images that try to convey empathy, and then you try and work with visualizations that set some sort of context. But very often, the experience of the individual, because you can report on it at micro levels, carries more empathy than the sheer weight of numbers that you're talking about. That's not to say that you just need to put photographs on top of every data visualization. People have become quite effective at kind of innovative ways of working empathy into pure data visualization. This is a graphic from Simon Scar, the South China Morning Post. I don't know if anybody's seen this one, Iraq's Bloody Toll. Has anybody seen this one? No? So the story with this chart is it's just a bar chart, but you can see what's happened. What's he done to the bar chart? He's just inverted the axis so that as the value increases, you go down the page. And by carefully curving the corners of the rectangles on the bars, it gives this impression that we've got blood dripping down from the horizon. It's a really clever visualization. Note, it is not an endorsement to suddenly make every bar chart draw downwards from zero. It's a contextual design decision that works beautifully because the designer is aware of the emotion and the empathy associated with this data. And in fact, the interesting thing with this data is if you see the dark red at the very top of the chart, that's the coalition forces deaths. The rest of this red is civilian deaths. So it's a fairly powerful graphic in the same sort of vein as Minard. And I've always liked this graphic from Otto Neurath about the fate of soldiers in World War I, because here the empathy comes from using exactly the same icons for both sides, for both armies. And that the only thing that distinguishes them is that they're walking back from war in different directions. It's tremendously powerful. And what I wanted to finish on was the fact that you should be able to surprise people in visualization. So surprise is a good thing, generally, with data. If you surprise people, you're more likely to make what you're showing them memorable. So as long as you're showing something that's the right kind of surprise, so not like I could put up a picture of a gorilla here, and that would surprise you. You wouldn't be expecting to see a picture of a gorilla in my talk, but you wouldn't be much wiser for it. So surprise people with something interesting and useful that they're not expecting to see. And it turns out that it's pretty easy to surprise people. One of the things I had a lot of fun with in my last year at ONS was reading Daniel Kahneman's book. People are pretty terrible intuitive statisticians. And actually, if you're producing and publishing statistics, you should be aware that you're not publishing and producing statistics to a blank page of people just didn't previously have any ideas about this topic, and now you've published it and now they do. Actually, people have their own intuitions about what data values might be, and so surprise is one of the things where you can correct it. And so Ipsos Mori have done a whole range of studies under this tag of Perils of Perception, which are brilliant for highlighting how different people's perceptions of data are from the reality. Americans estimate that nearly 32.1% of the working age population is unemployed, according to Ipsos Mori. Who knows roughly what the real figure is? 6%. Okay. Even better, this is one of my favourites. Australians think that 18% of their population are Muslim. What do you think it really is, according to census? 2%. You know, way out. And this is on fairly fundamental stuff. One of the things that I realized, so we did a quiz at ONS, which was really funny. We did like a Know Your Area quiz where people typed in their own postcode and you could find out how well you did or didn't know your own area. And I see Glenn's here today. I don't know whether I should say that John Pullinger only got 44% on it. Oh, hang on, I just did. Even the experts aren't necessarily great intuitive statisticians, because our own sense of what data values might be is informed by our own experiences and, dare I say it, what the media might be saying. For example, you know, reporting by exception rather than normality can really hugely vary how people perceive this data. And what's particularly powerful about this element of surprise is that when you make it personal, people are much more likely to take it on board. So another one of the Ipsos Mori questions when they first did this was, for every 100 girls in Britain, how many get pregnant every year? Okay. Now I thought I spotted a great chance to use this particular one because I did a talk at St Paul's School for Girls in Hammersmith last year, and I went to the visuals with it. I said, here are 100 teenage girls And so there was a room full of schoolgirls that said, how many do the British public think get pregnant every year? And what do you think the British public thought? 15. Spot on. That's what the British public thought. Now, I got to this stage of the presentation with the girls, and I said the British public think 15 out of every 100 girls get pregnant every year. Pandemonium then ensued. They were outraged, completely outraged that the British public could think that so many of them, because they saw themselves in the icons quite clearly, and in fact the headmistress had to restore order after 5 minutes. It was a very interesting presentation experience, because then, of course, the question was, well, how many of them do get pregnant every year, and who's prepared to suggest what that is? Well, actually, I'd need to have 200 icons before I could colour one in. And so, again, we've got that same level of variation in terms of perception and reality. And the visuals can help do that, because people then go away with a memorable image that's taught them something, that they will remember and that is useful. And that's what we want to do. Fundamentally, we want to change people's perceptions based on data. Otherwise, what's the point in doing it? Would we do it just to confirm what people already know? No, we want more insight than that. So thank you for bearing with me. Apologies for my late arrival, Keith. Happy to take any questions on that. Thanks.
I think at least a couple of questions.
Yeah.
Yeah, there is coffee coming, right?
There will be
Good.
coffee.
I'm looking forward to that.
Hi, thanks, very interesting. I was wondering how your audience has changed from shifting from ONS to the FT. So the sorts of people you're making these visualizations for, I mean, obviously you must think about who they might be, and I was wondering how, in terms of your process or the sorts of, certainly the data you're looking at is different, but I wondered if that was a conscious change in the way that you worked.
I've got to be careful, because we've got some ONS and FT people in the room.
I was going to ask a much harsher
question. All the audiences for both organisations are very handsome and well-informed people. Actually, there's a couple of interesting things. A lot of the work that we got involved in the last couple of years at ONS was based around some work that we'd done on user personas for ONS data, and a general concept to expand the audience that we were attempting to connect with at ONS, actually. So as well as the traditional sort of policymakers and analysts, we were also trying to connect with what we would call the inquiring citizen, which is somebody who, almost like a tourist. And the plan with it wasn't that we could get those people to the ONS website, because they'd probably be in for a slightly disappointing experience at that time, given that background, but to produce content that would actually go beyond those shores. So actually at ONS, the target was a wider audience than you might have thought the case otherwise. At the FT, it's much of the same sort of thing. What we've got is a kind of range of readers. Big difference is that it's a global readership, so that makes a big difference. We're not just producing content for a UK market, but you can't make too many assumptions about what kind of backgrounds those people have. And as we've seen, even experts don't, you can't shove something at the experts thinking they'll get that, because we know that's not quite necessarily the case. The same sort of principles. The reason why I've structured this talk in this way is that those principles apply across both ONS and FT audiences, in my view.
Glenn Watson from ONS. Alan, brilliant talk as usual. Thank you very much. I just want to ask you, after a brief spell at the FT, is there anything that you would suggest that ONS needs to learn from the experiences of doing this in a very different environment? And my second question is, depending on how you answer that one, when are you going to come back and work at ONS?
Well, you know, there we go. What? So, I mean, I thought there was something really interesting in what we were doing at ONS, is that we were trying to push the boundaries, particularly with James's question in terms of connecting with a wider audience. And I think if that is something that ONS really sees as a goal that it wants to pursue, then editorially it needs to get a bit braver about saying what its statistics are supposed to inform, is my number one view with that. So I think, for example, it's probably quite difficult to say you're going to inform the election debate if you can't mention the word election. You know, you have to kind of be much more open and honest in terms of what are your outputs trying to do, how are you trying to... yeah, it's not quite the same as saying don't be neutral, because you do need to be neutral, but I think you need to make it very clear why you're producing something. That would probably be my number one takeaway. Because at the FT, obviously, you're supporting narratives all the time. ONS's role is slightly different because it's a data producer first and foremost. It's not a newspaper, so there's some difference. And the answer to question number 2 will have to wait until at least the coffee break.
Brilliant. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks.